Okay. This was really good information. I really appreciate your taking the time to speak with us, Matthias. I wanted to get a little bit of input from Edward and Trish on this discussion, and what everyone's thoughts are in terms of how libertarian the society was in Iceland, if there were elements of liberty that we see, um, and where maybe it worked and where maybe it didn't work, and what we might need to do moving forward to make something like this achievable.
Okay, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that the more anarchic elements of the Icelandic government was more due to the fact that there wasn't a lot of power to concentrate. So for a long time, they were simply fighting against the environment so much and so isolated from the rest of Europe that they didn't need to worry about invasion. So because they were so busy just collecting resources and building their own communities, that they had neither the time nor the resources nor the motivation to form some kind of centralized government.
Well, you could perhaps say that. On the other hand, the descendant society of Iceland, the Vikings who went to Greenland, in the southern part of Greenland, what we see there, we don't have a lot of literature to inform us on what type of society it was and such. But based off of archaeological remains, it kind of looks like that society very quickly formed a very steep hierarchy. Yeah, so that's interesting to consider as sort of the opposite here. That might be because of resources, perhaps. In what we see in Greenland is that they continue in the early period with the traditional farming practices that they know from Iceland and Norway, but then have to start hunting more and more and living off of the various animals that live in the land. And eventually, having a cow is only something that the very, very richest of rich person can do. So there, in that area, we see another tendencies in which to start to form a hierarchical society. So there's something that there might be something else going on and in Iceland, and I'm not sure exactly what it is. I mean, it could be, if the sagas are telling the truth about the motivations for leaving Norway, that people did not want that king. Then it might be some kind of simmering ideology in the Icelandic society at some point. I don't know. I mean, that's a guess simply.
So it may have been partially cultural then. They were just so fed up with central authority that they were very skeptical of people who wanted to take on more central control, perhaps.
I'm hesitant to just say that is the case, but I mean, that is kind of what the saga literature is saying. As I mentioned earlier, with the earlier literature doesn't really mention this, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't have been an attitude that was in place at the time when that earlier literature was written. Of course, it's very pronounced in the saga literature being written in the 13th century, because that's where we see the Norwegian king really tightening his grip on Iceland eventually. So there could be some kind of anti-government sentiment in the Icelandic culture in the beginning. That's not impossible.
Okay, excellent. So, yeah, go ahead, Trish.
So kind of building on, Ed's observations here. I mean, I do see where, culturally, especially during that time period, if a king was coming in and expressing some kind of control and they were at some level resentful over this, that the potential for we were living this way, you were disrupting our lifestyle is there. But I'm also seeing sort of in those periods of anarchy where there was some kind of structure forming, there was some kind of I would say, you know, law starting to form amongst how they interacted with each other that ultimately ended up with a more formal style or more formal styles of government, and then an actual government. So it sort of lends, I mean, I think the beginning sort of lends to the idea that there was some sort of anarchy, that there were some problems with this anarchy. You know, there was no real enforcement of, you know, crimes against people, and, you know, there were raids, and, you know, people fought over property and things like that. Which are some of the complaints that people say, well, if you had your anarchist society, this is what would happen. And then as they start to formalize these things, it becomes, you know, they start to get more formal laws and things like that. I have one sort of question about that, and it's sort of, and it brings us to modern times. It's sort of, because obviously there's a path here, and how things formed, and it sort of informs what Iceland is today. What are the features that you think are very unique about Icelandic culture today that have sort of formed because of this history? You know, I know a few Icelandic people. You know, one of the interesting things I find about Icelandic people is that it's almost like if you're from Iceland, everybody knows everybody. It's such a small country. So it's very unique in many ways, as far as, because not only is it an isolated island, but that the population in general is pretty small, and you've got this sort of community, this sense of community among Icelanders that I don't see a lot among other cultures. And I find it absolutely fascinating. So I almost want to hear a tiny bit about that, not too long, but enough that, like, you know, I can kind of connect the dots here.
So I'd say that you noticed that because you're American. Because you find that too, and it's not because, so in Iceland what we're seeing is that you know, contemporary culture is yeah, people are very tight-knit in different ways, obviously because the population is small, but you have the same thing happening in Norway and Denmark in particular too. So in that sense, Iceland, on that particular point, Iceland doesn't distinguish itself from the, at least some of the other Scandinavian cultures. I can't speak too much for Sweden. But one thing that I would say as a Scandinavian who, you know, comes from Denmark, I spent a lot of time in Iceland, I lived in Iceland for a period. One thing that I have observed that distinguishes Icelanders culturally from the other Scandinavians are their willingness to take risks and being opportunistic, basically. And that is something that I also see in the American population as a European. I see you know, opportunism and risk willingness being much more prevalent in the North American culture than it is in the European culture. And this, I think, if I may be sort of a pocket philosopher here, this, I think, actually does have something to do with sort of the terms under which the societies were formed, reaching back probably very far. You know, some kind of there's more entrepreneurship in a sense, at least a mentality of entrepreneurship in Iceland. I feel like personally, that's what I've observed, than you necessarily would see in Denmark and Norway. It doesn't mean that there isn't a lot in Denmark and Norway, but it seems to be something that people are more inclined towards in Iceland. Like one of these, and I personally, I find that a very like liberating aspect of Icelandic culture. Like you sit there and talk with your friends about, oh, I want to do this and that, and I have great plans, and they're all like, yeah, awesome. whereas, you know, in Denmark, people are going to like, yeah, but what about that little problem and that little problem? Are you sure you're ever going to succeed? You know, a very different attitude, you know. And the same is here it's the case for the United States. I feel like the culture here, you have some kind of grand idea about something and people are like, yeah, go realize it. Whereas, you know, in Europe, you will run into critical voices, you know, in so many different ways. So that's, I would say, a difference that you could perhaps ascribe to the history of Iceland. Now, whether or not that is sort of a mentality that has persisted since the Viking Age, or this is something that has been developed in more recent times based off of sort of reflecting upon the history, that's another question. I would say that, you know, all in all, Iceland as a culture is so very integrated into the rest of Scandinavian society. They despite the fact that we Scandinavians, we are so or we can so easily find differences between one another. As soon as you step out of Scandinavia and you look at this from for instance the perspective of over here, people are, you know, these cultures are very close and very similar to one another. And so, but on that point, that particular issue of the opportunism and risk willingness, I think Icelanders are a little more proactive than the rest of the Scandinavians. Another thing that I want to suggest in this regard is that as I also teach indigenous cultures of the Arctic, and one thing that I find particularly interesting in when you talk about, you know, historical precedents of these libertarian societies or libertarian-like societies, look into the Inuit societies in Greenland and Canada, Nunavut, and Alaska, because what we see there in these societies is actually what looks to be a lot more voluntary engagement with community. One of the things that we see, for instance, in Inuit culture is that if you have unresolvable problems with the people in your village or you know, the community, then you leave. And people have traditionally in these societies also been less prone to violence because they recognize that this is not the best way to solve a problem. Conflict needs to be resolved through various other kinds of cultural mitigators. And on the other hand, what we also see in these societies is a very strong tendency to share resources, right? Obviously, born from the fact that if you don't share resources, you'll probably end up dying on some ice floe somewhere, right?
Sounds like some form of a free market.
Right? No, it's I think these and this is something that I also say when Edward, when you were talking about these type of mutual aid societies or groups that still exist in society today. One thing I was thinking about were my Native American friends who have this. You know, what to us coming from these Western societies, European societies, seems like, oh wow, they have like this tendency to, you know, share their resources in different ways just off the bat, where it's really surprising when you've grown up in a Western culture that stipulates that you have your own property and that you cannot infringe upon that, right? In a very voluntary way. So these networks of voluntary sharing of resources I seem to be a very old, long-standing way of interacting between indigenous cultures in North America.
It sounds almost like they are almost built into our DNA, because you've mentioned several hunter-gatherer groups like the Inuit and the Sami and now the Native Americans, who all seem to share these traits in common.
It does, right? I mean, then one of the interesting things is that, with the idea of property, is land in particular, right? Where does that come from? Well, it comes from the early agrarian societies. We have somebody who builds a farm, and they're growing their food there, right? And if other people say, what?
This is now my stuff.
Exactly. But it makes perfect sense too, because like you're growing your food. If other people start taking it, you've wasted your labor, right?
Yes, it's an investment and you have to protect it at that point.
Exactly. So then societies start making rules for these little plots of land. But yes, hunter-gatherer societies have had a very different relationship to ideas of land and property, right? The idea that you can own, a spot of land doesn't make a lot of sense, because what you're focused on are the animals that move across it, right?
Yes.
So anybody is sort of allowed to settle over here, and this is nobody's territory in that sense. Yeah, you might have a tribe that uses this particular area, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't move through that area or something like that, right? And in the same way, in those types of societies, by sharing resources, you're of course also establishing tight bonds to other people, and that of course is an asset more than anything else. So and that is both a utilitarian realization, and also a voluntary engagement.
So this is great. Edward, Trish, any other thoughts on this? Have we figured out if Iceland was in fact a libertarian society or not?
As we think of libertarianism, probably not. I mean, in terms of modern philosophical libertarianism, probably not. But I think there were aspects of anarchy that worked for them at the time. They had their kind of own system of handling things, but I wouldn't call it. I wouldn't use it as an example of where our versions, across the board, whether it be modern anarchist thought through libertarian minarchy, or night watchman states, etc. I don't think we really had that in Icelandic society.
Yeah, I found it to be a very stimulating conversation. A lot to learn from previous cultures. We like to think that today we know everything and that we've got it all figured out, but I think there's still a lot to learn from history.
Yeah, I think so too. And ultimately, as we said in the beginning of this conversation, the goal is to find the truth, whatever that truth is. And it sounds like, based on this conversation, Iceland probably isn't the best example for what we're trying to show people. Now that said, there may be more information that we come across in the future, and if that happens, we'll have another conversation about it and see if there are some things that we can figure out. But in the meantime, I think this is wonderful. And Mathias, how do people find you online? You have a YouTube channel, right?
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel. If you search my name on YouTube, you should be able to find my channel. I also have a webpage or website called NordicMythologyChannel.com, where you can see blog posts and other things. And yeah, I also have a a Facebook page and an Instagram and all that stuff. So there's the Nordic Mythology channel that I run for on YouTube is on Facebook, and I am personally on Instagram. So people can find me and get in contact if they're interested in.
Yeah, that's excellent. And you teach in Colorado?
Yeah, at Boulder.
Awesome. I think, Edward, you're not too far from there, right? If you wanted to take a class.
Just over the border in Salt Lake City, so not very far at all.
I just want to say thank you so much. Like this, I mean, this is the type of thing that I love to hear about and love to, it's not my area of study, but I certainly, as a student of political science, you have to kind of know what's happened before and why things form the way that they do. And I think this was an amazing sort of crash course on how Icelandic society formed. And I'm absolutely fascinated. I'll probably spend hours tonight before going to bed reading more, because now it's like what happened with Ireland. I am of Irish descent, so that gives a little more reason there. But there's it's just so, like, this type of thing is so fascinating for me. World history, and sort of how political science forms, from that, and how, you get that. And so I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us, because I'm really, really fascinated by this.
Yeah, that's really great. I feel like we learned a lot here, and if you're interested, I'd love to have another conversation with you about those Inuit societies that you had mentioned, because I find that really fascinating to see what aspects of their cultures were voluntary in more depth.
I think the projects that are geared towards like actually investigating, well, how can we maximize individual freedom for human beings on the planet, especially in a world where we're growing in numbers and trying to figure things out, and there are remnants of old systems in different ways that are sort of conflicting with people's capacity for being free in different ways. This is a really important topic to actually discuss and investigate deeply.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think with our project, we're also obviously very excited about it. The biggest part of it, the biggest problem that we libertarians have is just many of us are not good communicators, and we don't want to talk to people outside of our circles. And sometimes the reverse is true, where we want to express ideas, but people are kind of off-put because of their previous interactions with libertarians, because we do know everything.
Don't we all?
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, the purpose of this project really is to sort of break down those barriers to communication and talk to people about ideas, and discovering what worked and what didn't work, and how we can learn lessons from history to find a path towards more liberty. That's really what it's all about. So yeah, excellent. So seriously, I'd love to schedule something. Maybe we could talk on email in a few days or whatever, to talk about the Inuit people.
Yeah, that would be really interesting too. Yeah, we could sort of like take a circumpolar tour and talk about the different peoples that I have knowledge about in Siberian areas.
So amazing.
Yeah, and go into the Inuit as well. I mean, because those are also reference points for Kropotkin when he's talking about mutual aid. He did see something in the different peoples in Siberia, where he's like, oh, wait a minute, something is happening here. And as I mentioned in the email, there seems to be this general attitude during the Soviet era in Russia that these so-called sparse people are some kind of like proto-communists, basically. Mm-hmm. That they have these communal societies, but they're too free.
They're too free. No. And it's really funny because one of the arguments and people, so I mentioned earlier on the idea of libertarian socialists, and there are plenty. And Kropotkin is a seminal philosopher, political philosopher in that area. And I've always separated the idea of communism, like state communism, versus what I tend to call communalism, which is actually acceptable to me as a form of people in communities banding together voluntarily to aid each other and to and I think that even the anarcho-capitalists at some level all sort of believe that it actually is almost necessary for people to aid each other in order for that community to work. You cannot stand on your own. It just does not completely, work out. We're human beings. We are communal people. And like you said, it's possibly in our genes. So if you want to have your voluntary society that has, look, family structure is essentially communal structure. Like, most families, I mean, not mine, but most families stick together and help each other. You have sort of those patterns even in the people who would be considered the far right of libertarianism. They still have some level of belief in that sort of system. And I think that talking about how I do believe that at some level, what you were talking about with like the Inuit and look, I have a lot of Native American friends. I grew up in a town that had a Native American tribe. So I'm very well aware of, Native American culture, especially in the Northeast. There are real elements of, both the individuality of the person itself and the communal structure that I find absolutely fascinating and encouraging. So that's, I'm fascinated by all of this. This is great.
Good stuff. You know what I'd also like to talk about in the future is how something like medieval Icelandic culture could remanifest itself in the age of technology. Imagine if the Vikings or whoever had mobile phones and the internet, what would that do?
Oh wow.
I think
Wow, that's a real theoretical paper there for Mathias there.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is that these days we are seeing a sort of remanifestation. There's so much interest in sort of Viking Age and Scandinavian culture in North America these days. I sort of compare it to what I call the Celtic vibe back in the 90s, where you had music that was sort of Celtic inspired and all that stuff. And now we have sort of a Viking period going on right now. And
one of the most popular TV shows too.
Yeah, exactly. But it reaches far beyond popular culture at this point. For many people, this is, some kind of cultural awakening. Not least in a place like Norway, where they have a whole music festival, obviously heavy metal, that is based around. It's called Midgårdsblot, which means the sacrifice in Middle Earth, where they take the old Nordic word for like a ritual, a sacrifice, and that is like generating a whole new type of like identity for people in Scandinavia. Also, there's no town in especially Denmark and Norway with any kind of self-respect that does not have a Viking market in the summertime, where you have people dressed up as Vikings and so ecologically correct things and all that stuff. So yeah, it's the Vikings are present in a sense.
Sounds like.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other final thoughts here? We good? Okay. Very good, Mathias. Again, thank you so much, everybody. I will talk to you later. Take care.
Sounds good.
Sure.